What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into a tier list that I'm going to put together here on the spot here in the video, where I'm going to go through each of the decks that are currently in standard in the meta that are relatively overperforming in the sense that they're all over 50% win rate, and we're going to be breaking it down based on how they would possibly fall post-rotation, as we now are starting to get glimpses of what is to come standard rotation. This is definitely something that's kind of exciting, so it's definitely one of those things. If you have one of these decks already built, you may be already in a pretty decent position to possibly still perform very well without actually having to craft too much to really replace maybe what you're losing come rotation. With that being said, this is definitely something that's just kind of my opinion based overall. It's definitely, we don't really know how rotation is going to happen, how really much of an influence Dominar Unite is going to have overall on the meta. But with that out of the way, let's just dive into the tier list and let's just start talking about all these decks. So the first deck up we have on the tier list is Mono Black Control. Now, this is definitely a popular archetype that I think a lot of people have played. If you're someone who likes Control, also likes the colors of Mono Black, it's definitely a pretty good deck overall currently in the meta. It's at roughly about at 55%, a little under, I guess, at 54.6. It has a decent amount of matches played in the current meta. It's definitely a deck that is something to be reckoned with, as it does play some very, powerful cards, just because, it's a monocolored deck. It does have a card called Blood in the Snow, which is definitely a very good removal spell. It also has Lilith the Planeswalker, which is definitely very good for a control style deck. So definitely a good deck in general, just to kind of lock down what your opponent is doing for the most part, really keeping the board clean, allowing you to kind of take over that board and play your powerful spells to kind of keep your opponent really off the board in general. Now, this is definitely a deck that will lose some key pieces come rotation, but I do think it's one of those decks that, it's still going to be a competitor in some form or manner, just because you still have cards like Meathook Massacre. You also, we have, Invoke Despair. We have, spot removal with, Infernal Grasp and things like that. The one downside is we haven't really seen anything from Dominar Unite that really replaces like Shambling Gas and Eye Twitch, or even the card like Deadly Dispute. Now, those are some key cards that help you kind of keep your draws and keep your, keep getting that card advantage, which is definitely very good. But I would probably sit here and rank it somewhere in, like the B tier as something that is still, it's probably going to be pretty good, just because monocolored decks are definitely inexpensive in the sense that you don't need to craft a bunch of, dual lands and things like that to really make it effective. So I'm going to put it at a B tier, as I do think it'll still be a very, high performing deck. I don't know if it'll be the top tier deck, just because sometimes Control and Best of One does struggle against the more aggressive aggro decks, but still, nonetheless, still a pretty solid deck to play come rotation. Now, the next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Blue Delver. Now, this is definitely a pretty sweet tempo deck. It's definitely a deck I'm a fan of. I like playing like those tempo style decks where you kind of, play a little bit aggressive, but at the same time, too, you keep mana open to be a little bit on the control inside. It does lose a couple key pieces, like, Ascendant Spirit being another one-drop outside of Delver, but it still has a lot of good things that kind of keeps the tempo alive. It itself is also another deck that sits roughly around 55% overall win rate in current standard. It doesn't lose too many, spells, in the sense that it does have all the counter spells that it does play for the most part. Either has some sort of replacement that's kind of a one-to-one, and also the rest of the creatures of the deck are definitely cards that will still be around. I also think this is a deck that may play some Ledger Shredders as well, especially because it's one of those things that you gain benefit when your opponent decides to play multiple spells on the same turn. So I do think, just like Mono Black, I do think Mono Blue Delver is another deck that will probably still be somewhere that's going to be above 55%. Yet again, it's going to be kind of a wait and see when we fully get Dominar United and what really it does to some of the decks that are also on this list, or if there's going to be a new deck that comes out. But I still think it's going to be another deck that, if you still have it together, it'll probably still be a 55 percentage win rate overall kind of deck in the next meta once it rotates. So the next deck up on the list is going to be that Golgari Fight Riggin style deck. This is definitely a deck that still is still powerful in the sense that it does have a lot of good pieces. I believe you can just kind of play a lot of big creatures and still overall be very, very good. Fight Riggin's definitely a spell that if you get like your Shakedown Heavy on turn 3, get a Fight Riggin on either the turn before or turn after. All of a sudden, you're playing your Hideaway card, which could be another big spell that you get out on the battlefield for free. And all of a sudden, you're taking the game over in that regard. The one benefit to like playing a Fight Riggin deck post rotation is you don't have targets like Vanish Inverse that's really going to target your spells in that sense. So you definitely can hopefully get some stuff out on the battlefield before things start getting killed and whatnot. Fight Reagan's just one of those things that once it gets going, it's kind of hard to stop. And getting like things like Shakedown Heavy, which is good card advantage, Titan of Industry, maybe even the Slug makes an appearance, like Toxrill. But overall, a pretty decent deck. I'm going to put it as C tier just because I don't know, we could get more big green spells that may make this deck much better. But still, it's not like a deck that's definitely dominating currently in the meta. It's definitely probably like one that maybe breaks 50% overall win rate, as I do think the current one that is playing this card is somewhere a little bit below 50%. But I do think, Fight Riggin is in a very small pool with very big creatures. You could definitely get going and definitely still do fairly well with it overall. Now, the next deck up I have on the list is going to be Celeste Enchantment. Now, this is definitely another, enchantments and runes and stuff like that. It's definitely the other version. It's typically more aggressive, or you go the more enchantment heavy route and you played Hallowed Haunting. So there's definitely two variations that you could play to like Celeste Enchantments, but I do think it's definitely a good, budget deck, as the aggro version of the deck really doesn't cost too many rares. I think it's roughly around 12 or 13 total rares, and there's no mythics. If you also go if you go the Hallowed Haunting version of it, maybe it's a little bit more expensive, as the Hallowed Hauntings are mythics. And maybe a couple more additional rares. But I think it's a great deck. I do think this is definitely a deck that still performs very strong right now. I think it's roughly around a 57 to like 59% overall win rate, depending on what version you play. I do think it's going to be a deck that's probably going to be somewhere around the top of the meta overall. I do think losing like one of the runes that gives your creatures +1/+1 and trample may hurt the deck a little bit, but still, powering down your opponent with a bunch of big enchantment creatures that can grow really, really quickly is definitely going to be still quite a good overall, I would say, in the next meta. And I do think, this does have still a lot of pieces that will still be very good. I don't think this one got a dual land, as I don't think the friendly colors are part of the new dual lands that they do have. So you do have to play a little bit more of the slower dual lands currently. There's a possibility we may get a reprint of the green-white dual land to kind of help this deck out. But as of right now, I still think it's going to be a good deck, even if you don't play a bunch of your lands to really benefit it. I do think it's going to be probably a deck that's going to perform very well. Now, the next deck up is going to be the Jetpack Control style deck. This is definitely a deck that I'm kind of like interested in seeing how it will perform post-rotation. It does lose a couple key pieces, as this is a deck that likes to play Goldspan Dragon. It also likes to play things like Magma Opus, some very big, powerful spells because of Hanada's ability being able to make spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target. It's definitely going to be one of those things. Is Hanada going to be a still playable card in that regard? It's still a pretty solid card that is a 4/4 fly and trample card, but the rest of the pieces that kind of go around it will definitely hurt this card's overall value, as I do think there's maybe a couple cards that may have, targets, but I don't think you're going to get anything crazy like a 2-mana Magma Opus type of spell here with a Hanada Dawn Crowned. So definitely a card that is going to probably lose a little bit of its value in that regard, but it's still possible in like a control style deck that is Jeskai, as it does seem like they maybe are trying to favor some 3-color family style decks. It's still a possibility that you'll see some Hanadas here and there, just because it is still going to be a decent card. But I do think the Jeskai control deck that is currently around, I do think that's going to fall into that like regard of being somewhere in the non-playable, as it does lose a lot of key pieces that really makes the deck as explosive as it is for being a mixture of control and a little bit of an aggro spell deck. So I'm going to put it in the not playable, as I do think this is going to be one of those decks that's going to get a complete rework if it's going to be any sort of viable input in the next rotation. So the next deck up on the list is going to be the Mono Red Goblin deck. Now, this is probably like, I think, like a lot of people's favorite kind of like style aggro decks, as goblins are kind of always like one of those favored kind of tribal styles in MTG throughout its whole history. It's definitely pretty sweet. We did get a pretty decent goblin deck in this standard that we currently went through. It's definitely a deck that performed fairly well. It's definitely a deck people play a lot of, as this deck overall throughout its time being in standard has averaged over 55% in 100,000 games, which is definitely great, as the meta shifts and kind of peaks and ebbs as you get new cards and decks kind of pop up and go. So definitely pretty good. It's definitely a good deck overall, but just like the Hanada deck, it does lose a lot of key pieces, as there are a few goblins that got printed in like Kamigawa and things like that. We didn't really get a bunch of other goblins to kind of fill the places of a good chunk of the deck that is leaving the format. So this is definitely another deck, unless we are missing out on all these goblin reprints that are coming in Dominaria United. It kind of falls into that not playable area, just because it is a deck that loses a lot of pieces that really makes the deck good. So definitely, unfortunately, Mono Red Goblins kind of falls into the not playable area. So the next deck up is going to be Mono White Aggro. Now, this is definitely a deck that most people probably despise at this point, as it's definitely been prominent in the meta as a whole since its inception. Probably roughly around call time is when I think it got its big boom overall into a meta. It's definitely a deck that has a lot of good pieces. It does a bunch of things with just playing creatures without really having to play too many spells to really do other things with. You know, you have creatures that come in the battlefield, they do on a certain effect. They have creatures that come in the battlefield that tax your non-creature spells that your opponents are possibly casting. Looks at your opponent's hand, maybe taxes a card there. You know, it has Wandering Emperor, it has Luminarch Aspirant. Like, this deck just has a lot of good things that have a lot of value, you know, when you just play them without even having to play other spells. It does lose a lot of those pieces, but it does retain a lot of other cards that still can really fill those gaps. Maybe it won't be as good, but I do think this is going to be one of those decks that, you know, when you kind of look for a one-to-one replacement, I do think it's going to be a deck that really won't lose too much in the sense that it maybe at the beginning it'll be a deck that's still very prominent, like I said, as, you know, it loses like Luminarch Aspirant, it loses like you know, the Spirit, it loses Elite Spellbinder, you know, but still there's still a lot of great things with this deck. You know, it is another monocolor deck, so it's definitely on that side of, in a new meta where you don't really have to spend a lot of currency into replacing your lands, I do think this is still a deck that can still perform fairly well. Typically, when you have a much smaller card pool, not having to worry about fixing your mana and whatnot is definitely going to be a good thing. I still think this is going to be a deck that, you know, right now we're currently is performing roughly a little under 60% win rate. I do think this is going to be another deck maybe really early on that will perform very, very well, but we'll kind of see how it performs as the meta settles. But I do think mono white, if you're a player who plays this, you may want to look at cards that are either coming out in Dominar United, as there's a pretty sweet 2-drop that could replace Luminarch Aspirant that has the Enlist ability, or there's other cards that are 2-drops that could already replace it right now. So definitely a decent deck that doesn't, you know, as much as it loses, it still kind of doesn't really lose much ground in that regard. Maybe just gets a little bit more balanced in being more fair than what it is currently. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Black Zombies. Now, Zombies in general, I think, is a good deck to play with. You know, it does lack, like, Shambling Ghast overall, but because it's in that Mono Black family, you can, you know, get away with other cards that are within Crimson Vow and also Midnight Hunt. I haven't seen any zombies currently in Dominar United be spoiled, but you do have 2 sets worth of cards that you could put together, and typically in a very small micro, you know, format when it comes to standard. This is definitely another deck because it has a lot of cards that have synergy from, you know, 2 sets. It's going to be a deck that's going to still perform fairly well. You know, currently in the meta, it's probably somewhere closer to like the middle of the pack, just because it is roughly a little over 50% win rate. It does have its weaknesses, as, you know, a lot of your zombies need to kind of take some time to really get the effects going, but it is a deck that has a lot of value. It can also play things like Invoke Despair. It can play Meathook Massacre. It plays a lot of good cards. It does get a bunch of threats on the battlefield very, very quickly. I do think, you know, it's going to be one of those things that maybe, you know, right now it's not going to be, maybe it's probably going to still be somewhere in the middle of the pack, just because, you know, like last year, like these smaller card pools allowed the decks to have a lot of synergy early on, you know, perform very well. I actually think it'll probably perform somewhere around, probably around the middle of the pack yet again. I do think it's probably like a 50 to 55% overall win rate, just because, like I said, it doesn't lose too much in what it can do, but it does lose maybe a couple pieces, but I don't think it really affects the deck overall, and I still think the deck is decently nonetheless. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Green. Now, this is yet again another deck that's another monocolor deck that, you know, just because it's monocolor makes it have at least some advantage compared to decks that are multiple colors. It's a deck that loses about maybe half of the deck in one way or the other, as, you know, we haven't seen too many clear mono green cards that really stand out as being replacements for other cards that were definitely very good in mono green. I don't know if we've seen like a replacement for like a card like Blizzard Brawl or a fight spell that is on the cheaper side that is still decently pretty good. You know, Asika's Chariot is another card we lose here, but there are other cards that we currently have that are still in the format, like, you know, the Unwalled Oddity is one of the cards. We still have things like Ascendant Pack Leader. There is the dinosaur, the grass dinosaur that, you know, ramps you lands. You have things like Invoke the Ancient. So it's definitely a deck that I think, you know, still has some pieces, but we'll kind of have to go through a rework to kind of really see where it lands, as the current like curve of it is definitely very strong. You know, 2 mana 3/3 is something that you really can't beat, especially in you know, a very aggressive standard. But I would say this is definitely a deck that maybe, you know, isn't like in the middle of the pack. It maybe falls down a little bit. Maybe it's slightly above 50%. But I do think it's a deck that if you have, you know, it built, it's definitely a deck that can still be playable. As, you know, even though we lose the creature lands, we lose the snow lands, I think, you know, playing a monocolor deck is still definitely going to be very good. It's just definitely going to see, it's definitely going to be one of those things is, do we get enough to kind of replace cards that we're losing to make it super effective in the overall meta? So the next deck up on the list is gonna be Rakto Sacrifice. This is a deck that I'm a big fan of. It's a deck that is revolving around Anvil, getting a bunch of artifact tokens, and kind of slowly draining your opponent while also trying to be aggressive. You can play things like Omnixilus, you play vampires that create blood tokens. It definitely has a lot of things going for it, and you know, with it being kind of one of those things that it loses maybe like Deadly Dispute as being really the one big card I would say that it overall loses. It still retains a lot of things, and it's definitely a deck that is still pretty playable. I would say it's, you know, it's not a deck that was ever very, very strong. It's definitely a deck that once you get the Anvil kind of going and you're able to drain and gain a bunch of artifact tokens that kind of essentially replace themselves, I do think it's a deck that can really drain really quickly. It also has access to things like Meathook Massacre. You could try playing Invoke Despair. I don't know if you could really pull it off in a deck like this. It's also kind of a deck that you don't want to play things that are super expensive, as this deck really is a low curve, usually topping out 3 mana for something like an Omnixilus, but the rest of the deck is like 2 or less. So definitely a deck that I do think is going to be playable, as it really only, like I said, loses things like Deadly Dispute as being the one big card that stands out to me. It is a deck that probably takes advantage of, you know, not having to play the pain lands that are possibly coming. I don't know if there is a black-red pain land, but it's the card that you could play, though. You know, it's definitely one of those things. And if the format goes aggressive, you may not want to play, as this deck is probably setting itself up for more of a mid-range style deck. And Pain Life, especially against a very aggressive deck like a Boros Aggro or something, probably you don't want to do. But still, nonetheless, I do think Rakdos Anvil is definitely going to be one of those decks that is probably in B tier currently. And it's possible that it could jump up just because, like I said, it has a lot of synergy. It doesn't lose a lot of pieces to still be very good. So the next deck up on the list is technically like a mono red aggro deck, but it is a splash of artifacts, and that's going to be the mono red aggro artifact deck that's kind of been roaming around. This is definitely a deck that I feel like is under the radar, and you know, here and there you may see it pop up in like the overall meta, but this is definitely another deck that kind of has a lot of good things going for it. You know, it is a deck that is low to the ground. It plays a balance of artifacts. But it's a monocolor deck. It's not expensive. It has a lot of access to good cards. The idea of this deck is kind of think like the Rakdos Anvil deck. It's kind of like trying to trade your artifacts into things. It plays Patchwork Automaton, that whenever you play an artifact, you know, it grows by +1/+1. It also has Ward 2. It has things like Rapid Battery, Reinforced Ronin. You know, Voltage Surge is a great spot removal spell for 1 mana that can sacrifice an artifact and deal 4 damage to something instead. Just an overall very good low to the ground kind of deck, and I do think it's a deck, yet again, on the budget side. I think it could be very good post rotation, in the sense that it's not a very expensive deck to put together, and it does have a lot going for it. I think currently it's roughly around a 54% win rate overall in the meta. So definitely a deck that is performing fairly well. And I do think it's not one of those ones that can be at the top, but I do think it's kind of in this B tier area where it's kind of like in the middle of the pack. And it's just definitely be one of those things as we kind of see the meta develop. We'll kind of see how these middle of the pack decks go from there. But still, nonetheless, a good overall deck to start out with, possibly in a new rotation. So the next deck up is going to be Esper Aggro / mid-range. This is definitely a deck that's kind of popped up here and there. It's a good deck. It's kind of that deck that is really just a mono white deck with a splash of some Esper cards just because of how good they are. It's a deck that we'll have to kind of wait and see how these 3-color decks perform post-rotation. But overall, the Esper deck currently in the current standard is roughly over 56% win rate. You know, overall, it does lose some key pieces like your Lumeric Aspirant, but it does retain a lot of other things like Rafine, for example, being a great, you know, card, being a 3 mana 1/4 that gives everything. Whenever you attack, you get connive based on how many attackers you have, and then depending on how you discard, you get that many +1/+1 counters. It's a good deck. There are a lot of key pieces here. You could go the more mid-range route where you play things like, you know, the wedding announcement. Things like that. So definitely a good deck. I do think this is another deck where, as much as it loses some pieces, and we'll kind of have to wait and see how these 3-color decks overall perform, just because the mana is a little bit different. I do think it's a deck that is probably somewhere in the mid tier, but we'll kind of have to wait and see that if you have to play a lot more of these pain lands, is it going to still be effective currently in the meta? So the next deck up on the list is going to be Angels, and one of the various forms, you know, whether it's the mono white, the blue-white, the Esper, whatever combination you do play, it's going to be one of those decks that loses a lot of key pieces, one being like Righteous Valkyrie, you have things like Linvala, you have Legion Angel, you have like the Sagas that definitely help out the deck, Vanish and Burst, you lose out on Youthful Valkyrie, there's definitely some things that this deck will lose. It's definitely we've gotten some hints that there will be more angels. It's just gonna be a matter of, are there gonna be enough angels to replace what we've lost currently from the deck? And you know, it's a deck that does perform fairly well. It's roughly about a 57% win rate overall in the meta. It's going to be probably somewhere in between like the not playable and like the C tier, as I think this is one of those decks that if you have it built, it's definitely going to be quite the rebuild to get it back up to where it is. And it's definitely one of those things that is going to be worth it to really invest in all that currency if Angels doesn't really turn out to be. So I'm going to probably put it in the not playable just in its current form, as I do think it's going to take some time to kind of see the rest of Dominaria United, and I don't know if there's going to be enough power that it's going to replace the overall power of, you know, one of the angel decks that currently exists. So unfortunately, it falls in that not playable style deck overall in the meta. So the next deck up on the list is gonna be Naya Runes. Now this is probably that deck that everyone also kind of hates currently in the meta. It definitely sprung into the forefront of being a top meta deck in general, just because of Kamigawa brought in some good spells that help make the Stoneforge, the Runeforge champion, make all of the runes cost one less, on top of making it cost essentially 0, and you get a free rune and then get to draw a card and so on and so forth. It's definitely, unfortunately, a deck that falls in that thing that it plays a lot of cards that are going to be rotating. With it being a deck that is definitely very prominent, it is probably a top tier deck in the sense that it does perform roughly around 57% currently in the meta. But because you lose Runeforge Champion, lose all the runes, you essentially lose what runes is. And this is probably like the person who's thinking about, well, if I'm losing runes, but I like playing enchantment styles decks, this is someone who's probably going to move into that Celeste Enchantment deck. So I'm going to take the runes deck and put it in the not playable. But like I said, you probably want to start looking at like Celeste runes and seeing what Celeste enchantments and kind of seeing what you may have for that deck, if you are someone who likes playing these like enchantment tribal style decks. So the next deck up on the list is going to be another interesting deck, as it is kind of like a deck that is like a splash of mono white. It's Naya Humans. It's definitely a deck that I feel like a lot of people underestimate how good it is in the current meta, as I don't feel like this is a deck you see a lot of, but it's definitely a good deck when you do see it. It is playing around human tribal. It does lose some key pieces come rotation, like it does lose your Luminarch Aspirin, it loses your Elite Spellbinder. I guess Minsk is in the deck, but other than that, it doesn't really lose so much in the way that it's not going to be playable. It is definitely going to be one of those things, as humans are definitely the one of the more common types of creatures that are printed in most Magic sets, as I would say, unless it's like specifically for not human creatures. You usually have a few creatures in there, so it's definitely going to be one of those decks that we'll have to kind of wait and see, just double check to make sure that, you know, we have a decent replacement. There are also decent humans that are currently in the current sets that are released that you could kind of fill in the roles of some of the cards that you are losing in the main deck. I do think this is kind of like going to be in the middle. It's going to be kind of a wait and see on how the overall meta develops. But I do think, you know, Naya Humans could still be a mid-tier deck overall, even if it doesn't have a lot of explosive cards like it does currently. Even though technically the Naya Humans deck is just mono white with a splash of some Naya cards in general, but still nonetheless a good deck. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Boros Burn. Now this is definitely a top tier deck in general. It's a great climb-in deck, I would say. I don't know if it's at the top of the meta, as I'm typically not in Mythic, if it's still a deck that you could still grind all the way up to the top of the Mythic if you're looking to get towards the higher tier numbers in general when it comes to playing Standard. But I do think this is definitely still going to be a powerful deck. It only really loses Luminarch Aspirant, Royal Eruption, and probably the creature lands, but it does, you know, gain the dual lands. The pain lands will definitely be still pretty good here. It does look like we're going to get a replacement for for Royal Eruption with Lightning Strike getting reprinted in Dominaria United. The other thing too is, you know, is there going to be a new replacement for Luminarch Aspirant? That's going to be the one thing we'll have to kind of wait and see. But really, if you're losing those couple pieces but still retaining most of the deck, I do think this is going to be one of those decks that, you know, as well as it's performing out, I do think it's going to still be a high performing deck post rotation. It's a good aggressive deck that has a low curve, you know, has a nice 1-2-3 curve in the 1-2-3-4 curve, and has other cards that kind of, you know, go inside with that. You know, still you have even though you lose Royal Eruption, you get Lightning Strike, which is an instant version of Royal Eruption without the kicker. You still have Play with Fire. You still have Kamano. I do think, you know, Boros Burn is going to be that deck you're going to see like day one in the Standard as it rotates. A lot of people still playing with a couple maybe new additions come Dominaria United. So I do think this is probably the deck that is going to still be at the top. Unfortunately, if you're someone who's sick of it, it's not losing enough pieces to almost dismantle it. We'll have to kind of wait until next rotation really to lose a lot more key pieces from Boros Burn. But if you're someone who plays it, you're already in a good position to probably do very well come rotation. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Is It Mill. Unfortunately, this is one of those things that we haven't seen too many new replacement mill cards come with Dominaria United. And I do think it's sad to say that at least Is It Mill is done for as it comes to deck in MTG Arena. It's definitely one of those decks that is annoying to play against, but it's definitely it's a good deck. What it can do with just playing a bunch of cards that just put cards your opponent controls into their graveyard. It's unfortunately just not going to be playable because, like I said, we haven't gotten any new replacement of mill cards. We lose Tasha's Hideous Laughter, we lose Maddening Cacophony, we lose Rune Crab, which are essentially the 3 key pieces that makes Is It Mill kind of work. We lose one of the 2 copy spells when it comes to Dual Strike. Outside of that, there really aren't any other mill cards that you can really put in to replace it. So unfortunately, Is It Mill is going to be another deck that is another casualty when it comes to rotation overall in the meta. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Esper Aggro. Now this is one of those decks that I feel like it's still a very strong deck, but I don't feel like I see a lot of it. Though I think this is one of those decks that is a casualty to rotation, as really the 2 key cards that merely make the deck work. One key card that really helps make the deck work, as it is a good ramping card, is gonna be Goldspan Dragon. It does lead the format, and the reason why it's kind of like a key card for this deck is that Goldspan Dragon makes the treasures. The treasures, when Goldspan Dragon's out on the battlefield, produce 2 mana instead of the 1 mana when you sacrifice them, which this allows you to get out things like a Titan Industry maybe a turn earlier than normal. It loses some of the key cards that kind of go alongside of that. One of them being Dragon's Fire is another great kind of spot removal spell for 2 mana that deals 3 damage to target creature and or planeswalker. And if you have a dragon, you can reveal a dragon or target one of the dragons you control and it deals damage based on its power instead. It's definitely one of those decks that it's maybe going to be playable in one way or the other, but in this current form, you have to probably play a little bit more of that whole kind of mid-rangey style game, and not having like a Goldspan Dragon really will make Esper Aggro probably kind of fall off a little bit. So I do think, unfortunately, just like the last deck, this is kind of one of those decks, at least in its current form, until we maybe get a better idea of what cards will exist in these colors. I do think Esper Aggro is going to be another deck that probably you won't see too much play overall. Now, the next deck up on the list is going to be Gruul Werewolves, and just like Dimir Zombies, this is probably one of those decks that I'm kind of excited to see kind of pop back up in the meta. It's a deck that, just like Zombies, it uses really 2 sets when it comes to Crimson Vow and Innistrad Midnight Hunt. It just plays Werewolves, and those are the 2 sets that utilize the day-night cycle. It has a lot of pieces that will make the deck work. I do think maybe that we'll get a couple of new things that we can add to the deck to kind of make it overall more aggressive. I think Kamano is a decent card that will make this deck better. I do think it's kind of one of those decks that you saw a lot of when it got released, just because in a new standard, when you have smaller pools, the decks that have a lot of synergy early on are definitely very good. This deck has a lot of synergy, and it does have some good pieces, and I do think Werewolves will probably be in that mid-range. It's just going to be a matter of is it going to be aggressive enough to maybe compete with like the decks that are slightly above it, or is it going to be kind of like one of those things that it'll be kind of around in the first initial post-rotation deck list that people are playing, but kind of fall off once we get closer to like Brothers War and the next sets afterwards. So I guess it's one of those decks you'll have to kind of wait and see overall how it is effective in the overall meta. The next deck up is gonna be Orisa Control. Just like Mono Black, it does lose some key pieces. It does lose like things like Vanish-Averse. Some versions of it do play things like Lolth and whatnot. I don't know if any of them play, Blood on the Snow, but for the most part, it is still it's a good deck that a lot of people have played. It loses Shambling Ghast, but it does have some key pieces, and I know I personally did a video that it still kind of works. It can still grind if you're someone who's into grind and out games, with things like, Meat Hook Massacre. You can get tokens with Wedding Announcement. It loses out on Deadly Dispute, which is unfortunate. But maybe you could try to get like something like Invoke Despair into the deck. I know it's kind of like asking a lot for a control style deck, but because you are playing a little bit slower, you could get that 4 mana to help you play it. And I do think, Orisa Control is still going to be somewhere in the meta. It's just not probably going to be in the same form that you currently see it when you do play it. So I do think it's going to be in that way that we'll kind of, base it off of like a list and kind of wait and see, what other cards around it will kind of get and kind of go with when it comes to playing it in the overall meta. And the last deck up on the list is going to be that Boros Reanimator, whatever you want to call it. It's a deck that is kind of fun to play if you like playing some crazy, wonky deck. It is, You know, it uses Invoke Justice as the way to reanimate it. You usually typically try to get something like a Velomachus into the graveyard, as it is a creature that it comes out onto the battlefield as a creature that has haste and vigilance, and then you get to put 4+1/+1 counters on it. It attacks immediately for 9. Then you look at the top 7 cards of your library as it attacks, and you get to cast one of them for free. So you either get to cast, I don't know, another Invoke Justice, you get to cast the land that makes angels and makes all your creatures indestructible. It's a good deck. It's just unfortunately, I do think it's going to be one of those decks that kind of falls off post-rotation, as it does lose some of those key cards that kind of makes the deck what it is. One of them being the Velomachus is one of the cards. You still have Invoke Justice, but I do think Velomachus is kind of what makes that deck better than maybe what it could be if there wasn't a deck that, you know, has that effect of you play Velomachus and pretty much get free cards off the top of your library, like Amiria's Call. You get like a free, you get like, I don't know, Angel Fire Ignition, things like that. You know, it's definitely a deck that I think is going to be in some way. Maybe there will be like a mono white Reanimator where you can still play Invoke Justice. I just don't think, you know, we won't have a card like a Velomachus that's as explosive that can come out, you know, a little bit earlier and still be as effective as it. So I do think this deck falls in that not playable overall. So it's definitely one of those decks that I think, you know, some people will miss. I just don't see there being a card that replaces Velomachus to make this deck as effective, and it does lose a couple other cards that kind of help you, make you draw and discard cards to kind of get some treasure tokens out. With like cards like Throne Discovery and also Seize the Spoils, kind of some of those cards. There are other like a little bit more expensive cards that you could do the same effect with, but it's just a matter of you kind of are trying to curve out, get that Velomachus into the graveyard early, and then Invoke Justice it back on the battlefield. And I just think losing those key pieces to kind of help you ramp up is definitely going to be a pretty effective way to kind of almost like not make the deck playable anymore. But, you know, with that being said, you know, this is definitely quite interesting. I think I did a total of 22 overall decks. As you kind of see here, there's still another icon here. This is also for Esper. I didn't realize I added 2 icons for Esper, so I just went with the one. But overall, you know, each of these decks, I think, you know, are still in a decent spot. I do think, you know, having a standard where we kind of got towards the end, a lot of decks that kind of popped up, you know, overall that still performed fairly well. It's definitely going to be interesting to see what decks will still perform fairly well. But I do think this is going to be somewhere roughly around where the meta falls. I don't, you know, it's one of those things that we'll have to kind of wait and see how Dominaria really overall affects it, or where people kind of sway. But I do think this is probably a good way to kind of look at where decks will fall when it comes to the meta. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Is there a deck that maybe I didn't go over that maybe you think could pop up into the meta and fit its way into a higher point and maybe where it is currently? Is there decks that you think that would perform better or worse? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this style of video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.